Okay, Mr. Gallaway, I'm going to ask you the first question. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, why did you become? I'm sorry?
I said I've been waiting for this.
Oh, okay. Here we go. Why did you become interested in the topic of shared parenting in Canada?
Well, I I didn't really become interested in it, or it came to me. Understand that the whole business of shared parenting came about as a result of a recommendation in a committee report 23 years ago, and that recommendation was written by two people. The recommendation with respect to shared parenting I'm talking about, it was Ann Cools and me, and shared parenting was an idea that was floating about in various circles, wasn't widespread, and Ann was very plugged into a lot of these academic groups, and from that we proceeded with it into the report for the sake of the children, and that's how we got there.
Okay.
And we got into shared parenting simply because the other systems, custody and access, were not options; they were failures.
How did you gauge? What did you measure it against as a failure?
Well, understand.
Well, or just generally, I guess.
Well, I don't think, if I look around at who's on this line, I don't think I have to convince them that custody and access is a failure. But we had a long period of hearings with respect to custody and access in divorce.
Right.
And we were supposed to find ways to improve it. And this was the way that we saw to improve it. Now, it wasn't just the two of us, understand that. It was a committee. So it was a bunch of people we had to bring along with us. It wasn't a very easy thing to do.
Politicians.
No All doubt. Of them.
Yeah, I'll bet. Okay. Second question I have, do you have any personal experience with parental alienation? Something in your life or family or?
No, I don't actually. It's peculiar, isn't it? That well, I don't know if it's peculiar, but I'm not. I've been married a long time. I'm not divorced. I have 4 children. I have, and they're all married, and they're not divorced. And I don't know how do these things happen? I've been married a long time, as I say, and I'm not divorced. I don't know.
Lucky you.
Is it serendipitous? Perhaps, or partially. I don't know. I always think if you look at your family history, that can be an indicator. Although divorce is a more recent phenomenon in terms of long-term views of families.
Right.
But I have 3 siblings, and only one of them is divorced. So,
That's I
don't know. So I don't have, but with respect to, do I have any personal experience with parental alienation? Well, for quite a number of years, I was a politician, and I was a lightning rod in many respects for divorced men. In fact, I still hear from them. It's really odd. I mean, I had a call from a fellow who lives 100 kilometers away from me the other day. He tracked me down. I ran into a guy on the weekend who talked about the report for the sake of the children. So yes, I can think of some really profound, terrible cases of parental alienation that I've encountered along the way. Really just sick stuff.
That begs the question, what's the worst situation you've ever seen, I guess?
Well, the one that comes to mind is a fellow who was a high school teacher. And he had one child who was, less than 5 years old, just, getting ready to go to school. And his wife went, well, far be it from me to diagnose her problems, but
many of us here, yeah.
Anyways, his wife was shall we say, peculiar. And when the marriage started to go down, she became very enraged that he seemed to be coping without her. And so her bargaining chip, or her battle chip, if you want to call it that, was this child. And it was a whole series of events over time, but it was always about allegations. So one particular occurrence was he was about to see the child. Well, this
Right.
created panic. So she alleged that she had his laptop, or an old laptop computer of his, at her home, and there was child pornography on it. The ultimate zinger. And of course, the judges will listen to any allegation from a woman, and that would hold it up. And then they would have to go through a long period of analysis of this computer, and you know the routine.
Indeed, we do.
It would end up with nothing, but it went on forever, and it financially destroyed him.
Right.
He won in the end, but I don't know if you could call it really winning.
Right. Nobody wins, really.
Nobody wins. Yeah, and he was at one point he was charged with a criminal offense, and that was he was acting inappropriately with the boy, and of course she called the CA, the Children's Aid,
Right.
and you know what happens when that occurs, and he was charged, and eventually the charges were all withdrawn, or the charge was withdrawn. But it just was endless. It was sick. And what happens though is that there are no repercussions really to the guilty party, if I can put it in those terms.
Right.
Guilty party being the accuser.
Right. You mentioned repercussions. What I presume that you've seen a number of instances of this kind of thing, and there are, as you say, no repercussions for the other party. Are there what would be the word, things to prevent things like that, like legal charges? Or
do
you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I do, of course. There are things that could occur but never do.
Right.
And here's an example that has nothing to do with children.
Right.
We've seen in recent. I don't know where you are, where you live. Are you
I'm in Calgary, but I used to live in Ottawa.
All right. Well, very recently, the Toronto District School Board, of all things, banned a woman from coming to speak to a girls' book club at the schools. And her name is Marie Heinen. She's a defense lawyer. She's written a book. She's probably the most famous criminal defense lawyer in Canada today. And she wrote a book, but she was guilty of defending Jian Ghomeshi. Remember?
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, she was the lawyer who defended him, and he was acquitted. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there were 3 or 4 ladies who made accusations against him, which turned out to be patently false. Mm-hmm. And the judge made some pretty stern comments about this, but nothing ever happened to them. Nothing ever happened to them. And in fact, CBC has been known to call them on occasion about being victims. So there's a mindset that there's a narrative, I guess you would say, which makes it very difficult to do anything about these things, or that nothing ever happens.
So even though there are laws on the books for contempt of court, that kind of thing, there's never any.
How often is a custodial parent who denies visitation or access, like visitation rights, to the other party, ever, it goes on and on and on. How often are they charged with contempt of court?
Right.
Can you tell me? Can anyone tell me?
No. Well, I'd go with a big 0, but
yeah. Well, there's been maybe 1 or 2 occasions that I can think of, but it's that's over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying I've heard of all of them either, but it's a very rare event. Right. So. Do we need more laws? Probably not. Do we need the laws to be enforced? Yes.
Or the laws changed, I suppose.
Yes. Well, in certain cases, yes, of course.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Just because we got on late, I just want to let everybody on this call know that I have seen a couple of questions pop up in the chat.
Oh, okay.
So I have a couple. I still have about 6 other questions that I'm going to ask, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
All
Is
right.
everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
I just to generate ideas, and if you have questions that come to mind, I would suggest maybe writing them down or putting them in the chat, and we will get to them, just so that everybody knows. Okay. Can you define shared parenting as a default, and how would this differ from our current adversarial family court system?
All right. Well, shared parenting is you take access and you take custody. So you have an access parent and a custodial parent, and you put them together and you say you're both the same now. You are going to share the parenting obligations for this child and these children. No one parent has greater, shall we say, legal recognition or leverage over the other. You're both equal. And I know that they're out there across the country. There are now discussions about equal shared parenting.
Right.
The recommendation that was made, and let's understand that this recommendation is pretty old. It's 23 years old next week. This recommendation didn't say equal shared parenting. It just said shared. And what it looked at was that in the course of a marriage, parents share or spend time with their children at different rates. For example, a father may be working in his younger age bracket on his job, his career, and spending a lot of time working. And so sees maybe the children 30% of the time, and mom has the children is spending 70% of the time with the children. So in the case of that, the father would have, post-separation, post-divorce, would have the children 30% of the time. Now, I've used the case of a man and a woman, a man who's 30% sometimes, and I can think of many examples where the mother is spending more time out of the home than the father. And in that case, it would be whatever was best reflected in terms of percentages. It presumes that the parents would work it out, but if they didn't, the court would have to step in and do an assessment on how much time are you spending. But no one parent would have the right to deny, for example, the right to see the children's report cards. There's an example. That's a pretty simple one, where I can think of fathers who've gone to the schools to find out, hey, how's my daughter doing in school, and end up being arrested. It assumes that both parents are equal. So no longer can somebody call the police because the children haven't been returned. Essentially making stuff up. Yeah, essentially making stuff up. Yeah. So it's about equality of powers, if I could put it in. That's not a very good word. How about equality of rights to parenting? Or the child has equal access to both parents, in a way. Yeah, it's about the relationship between the parents and the child. Right. So no one parent has superior rights to the other. Okay. How would that compare to, like, from what I understand, the Swedish model has essentially what you were describing. How would we get to that? Something like that. Don't tell me about the Swedish model. Well, the Swedish model, if parents decide to get divorced, it's just a matter of going down to a courthouse or a justice of the peace or whatever the equivalent is in Sweden, and it's presumed that each parent is equally capable of raising the child, and if one parent feels differently, then they have to prove it. Well, that's the first time I've heard of that. I mean, the process is one thing that can change with time, but it doesn't radically change from that. Both parents are presumed to have the right to participate in the upbringing of the child. and how much time, it fluctuates because often parents start out and one parent spends less time with the children because of, as I've said earlier, work commitments. But when the child gets older, that shifts and the child
Right.
spends more time with the father,
Right.
the other parent. If I shouldn't distinguish father, mother, but I am.
Understood.
So that can shift.
Okay.
I've seen cases where a child, parents are divorced, obviously, and a child at age 16 says, "Hey, I want to go and live with the access parent," which is usually the father,
Right.
and will the mother will say no because sometimes that means there's a change in financial situations, but it occurs. So, in those cases, it can happen without a big battle.
Because I presume the ability for the family court system exists to have shared parenting equitably, because they always say with generous access to the other parent, right?
Generous access is just, that's a term that's what, 40, 50 years old.
Yeah. It's just tossed around.
But what is access? Access is much less than custody.
Right.
Custodial parent has all the cards.
All the control.
The access parents, access parent has none. And so that's why shared parenting is critical, because no one parent is better than the other.
Okay. How would shared parenting benefit families?
Well, one would assume, well, there's a number of ways.
Mhm.
Firstly, it would cut the battle over children, because you're going to know that you're going to have to spend, that both parents are going to have some time. That the principle is that children deserve two parents post-divorce. And that's the best interest of the child test. So how would it change? Well, it would stop the battles.
Right.
Or lessen the battles. There's always going to be battles. I'm not that naive. Secondly, it would ensure that children get to know their families, right? Because so often you hear children, "Oh, I know one side of my family, but I don't know the other. I have no idea who they are." Well, why is that? Well, because my parents were divorced, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it would change that. There's this huge thing, this huge silent group out there who are suffering, if I could say that, and that is grandparents. And grandparents are suffering because of the capricious nature of our divorce laws. They don't see, and I hear from people still. I hear from some people near Toronto, and their grandson lives close by to them,
Mm-hmm.
and he's forbidden to speak to them.
Wow.
He goes by their house. Surreptitiously says hello.
That's horrible. We do screen a movie called Erasing Family, and it's from the child. It's from the child's perspective, right?
Yeah.
And it's the first time I've seen it about 10 times now, but it's just tragic to watch how the parents.
I tell people in those situations that blood is always thicker than water. And that's a kind of a trite maxim, but I'll give you a little story. Many years ago, there are many grandparents groups across the country. They come, they go, but they still exist. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a group in Ottawa at the time called Grand, and I got to know a number of them. I went and spoke to them on occasion, and Ann Cools did too. And there was the lady who was the president of it. Her grandchildren were in Halifax or somewhere on the East Coast, and she never saw them. They just banged. They were like gone. All right, and she would every year dutifully send Christmas gifts, birthday presents. They never acknowledged. They never heard anything, and this went on for 15 years because they were just infants when this all came down. Anyways, one Thanksgiving, her doorbell rang. She opened it, and there was her grandson, age 18.
Oh my gosh! Because the child,
and he was at Queen's University,
right?
And grandma was just up the road in Ottawa. And he knew that, he knew her name, obviously, and wasn't difficult to track them down. And he went and knocked on the door. She was
Oh, that's wonderful.
She was blowing. I mean, it's just a magnificent story.
Right.
And it has all the happy endings after 15 years of heartache.
All the warm feelies.
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
that's good. Okay. When you worked on the Special Joint Committee on Custody and Access, what was that about? Or we probably don't have enough time.
All right. Well, I'll give you a really quick rundown. I'll be really fast. Does everybody, and I'm looking at people online here, does everybody remember, does anyone remember who Alan Rock was?
I do. I'm one of the older ones. I'm from Cape Breton with Alan. You may know Alan McEachern.
I know Alan McEachern. I knew Alan McEachern. Anyways,
yeah, he's from Mabu.
Yeah, well, I see you're Saint of X-Ring. So
sorry, I'll hide it.
Okay. So in 1990, well, firstly, Alan Rock was responsible for a great period of mayhem in Ottawa, and that was a bill called C-68, which was the National Firearms Bill. It has nothing to do with divorce, all right? But it was a time of great tumult, if I can put it that way, in Ottawa for members. So after that ended, he thought he would calm things down and he would create the child support guidelines.
Right.
And that created more friction and just generally hard feelings, because they were created in a way that wasn't open. It was all done by regulation. It was done by bureaucrats. It was, and it didn't recognize that both parents needed to contribute to the well-being of their children. Now, nobody knows really how the guidelines were created. Nobody knows what the equations were. Actually, I did succeed in getting some access to information for it, but it's really still pretty vague. All right. And as that was happening, it passed the House because it was different in the House. But when it got to the Senate, it hit a brick wall. The brick wall was a
surprise.
Two people. There were two people that formed a brick wall. Their names were Duncan Jessamine. He was an older conservative senator from Winnipeg, great guy. And the other one was a lady by the name of Ann Cools. And so they basically said, and this is a bit of a simplification, but they basically said, no, it's not going to happen. All right. It's not going to get by here. All right. And then there were certain procedural things. The Senate is much different. Anyways, so they struck a deal. Rock came, the justice people came to them. They struck a deal. And that was, it would pass the child support guidelines, but a committee would be struck.
Right.
Not only would it be a committee, but it would be a special joint committee, which is a very rare beast, all right, of the Senate and the House. And a special joint committee is supposed to have greater weight in its recommendations.
Right.
So that's briefly how it all came about.
Okay.
So it was born on December the 11th, 1997. That's a long time ago. And it started work in January of 1998. It had a budget of $500,000, which is not, I mean, it's nothing. All right.
And in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. And it had a year to complete its work. And that's how it all came about.
Good. What was the For the Sake of the Children report?
Well, that was the product of this committee.
Right.
So the committee met for several months. We crossed the country. This is what committees do. They hear from people, and it's you've got to understand it's a big bureaucracy on wheels, because there's translators, there's clerks, there's advance people, there's press people, there's security. It goes on and on. So it's a big deal.
Right.
It's a big traveling road show. Just as an aside, people might be interested to know that it had the largest turnout to meetings, I am told, of any committee.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it's such a big topic.
Thing.
it still is. All right. So, for example, in Toronto at the Royal York Hotel, we didn't have just some sort of a room. We had the ballroom,
Mhm.
and there were 400 people there. We had to
Really?
call the RCMP at one point to keep the peace. Right. So, and it was like that across the country. So it gives you some idea of the importance or the weight of the public view of this topic.
Right. Just as an aside, was there more interest in one region of the country than another, or was this right across the country?
Right across the country.
Okay.
I mean, Toronto being the largest center, we had the most people, but proportionately speaking, everywhere we went, there were big crowds.
And how did it work in Quebec? Same type of thing, because they have a common law system, right? Or a civil law. Sorry.
Civil law, yeah. No, we had big crowds in Quebec too.
Right.
Because even with their system, they have that. But remember that divorce is a federal law.
Mm-hmm. True.
And
right.
It applies in Quebec, yeah.
Okay.
So, yes, the same problems exist to a certain extent.
Just read it. Straight across the country. Okay. You've mentioned Senator Ann Cools a number of times. What views, and this is probably a loaded question, but what views do you share with her, and how do you differ in views? And being a politician, we only have an hour and a half, an hour and 3/4 left. So.
Listen, I was a member of the House of Commons.
Yeah.
Ann was a member of the Senate. Senators need members of the House because we have political legitimacy.
Mm-hmm.
And members of the House need people like Ann because she has had the time that we don't have as members to really drill down into these topics.
Right.
There's a difference. So I first met Ann in, 1991. She and I always got along except on one topic, and that was what should happen to the Senate.
They're still arguing about that one.
Well, in I don't know what year it was, 1995, I did a cross-Canada tour on my own with another fellow, an NDP member by the name of Lauren Nystrom.
Yep,
and it was
nice guy.
We did a summer tour of Abolish the Senate.
that didn't float.
Anyways, no, it was okay. And I did it because I was annoyed. I was annoyed that I had a bill, a private member's bill, and it was a big deal in those days. Some of your people here, I'm looking, aren't old enough to remember something called negative option billing. It's when the cable companies were the big parties. They would force channels onto people and make them pay for it. They had no choice. Anyways, it was about that, and the Senate defeated it. The House passed it, interestingly. It was the first bill to be passed in the House, but anyways, and I was annoyed. So I did that, but Mr. Chrétien, he was good about those things. You could do it, and he said, well, you have the right to do it. So
good for him. What were the roadblocks, challenges on family law reform that you've encountered, and why did these efforts fail?
Well, let me start at the beginning. Let me start with the committee. Understand that we had on the committee the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Justice. All right, she was there to report back to the Justice Minister on what was being said in our in-camera meetings.
Right.
Hardly discreet. Secondly, the Department of Justice sent people to watch every meeting as we crossed the country. They were flying along, right with us. They on a different ticket, being paid for by the Department of Justice to see what people were saying and put their spin on what was being said, and to speak to some of their favored groups along the way. Thirdly, we had opposition from bureaucrats who worked for the Minister of Justice. There was a case where a bureaucrat wrote a letter to an editor opposing something that had occurred that was being said at the committee. All right.
Right.
These things are very improper, very wrong. And so Ann and I would get out, we'd take pen to paper and go after them.
Right.
Then we had an occasion where the woman, the minister or whatever she was called for the status of women.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know.
All right,
Anyway,
Hetty Fry is
yeah, Hetty
her.
Fry. Yeah, thank you.
All right. She took a swipe at the committee, and we took a swipe back at her and asked that she resign. All right. So I mean those were the early days. Then we had some problems within the research staff that we thought was, no, they weren't being totally, they had a certain slant. I am not accusing them of bad faith. They just had a certain slant.
Well, human nature, right?
Yeah. So there were all kinds of institutional inertia. It doesn't want to move. All right.
I used to live in Ottawa. Yeah, there's a lot of inertia there.
All right. So despite all the odds, we got the critical recommendations through in the report, and of course the report has to be voted on by all the members. All right. So the members of the committee, that is. So we managed to do it. It wasn't easy, but we managed to do it. And then, of course, it is presented in the House and in the Senate.
Right.
And then the department has a certain 120 days or whatever it was to respond to it. The minister, that is. And the minister said, oh, I accept the report, and it'll take me 3 years to really do anything about it. Well, come on, 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Here's a weekend. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the minister unleashed her bureaucrats, and they started to have consultations, whatever that means. All right. Nobody knows what a consultation is in Ottawa. It's a meaningless word.
Free lunch.
Yeah, exactly. So the department then launched consultations across the country, and that entailed so they could hear from the public about the report.
That's ironic.
The public was the public involved those they invited. Right. So
right.
It wasn't a doors wide open, folks. It was, we will invite you, and you will
if you're what
so
we want to hear.
You can guess who they invited.
Mm. Yeah, it's like an echo chamber, essentially.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the women's groups, the women's shelter, all of those. Anyway, so Ann Cools and I went to Toronto one day to one of these consultations and knocked on the door.
Right.
And said, oh, yeah, we'd like to come in and listen. And the first reaction was, no goddamn way.
And then he beat the door down.
Here we are, a member of the House of Commons and a member of the Senate, and they won't let us into a meeting that's paid for by our tax dollars. Right. Well, we made a lot of noise, and they reconsidered very quickly and let us in. I mean, it was a pitiful experience. They had, lots, as you said, lots of free lunch for these people who were there.
Mm-hmm.
I called it muffin mania.
Muffin and coffee, yeah, exactly.
Anyways, and they had a really fancy room. It was in, I think, the Sheraton in downtown Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
And they spent $1.5 million, 3 times the amount that we had, doing these consultations. Wow. And then, of course, it went right down from there. They just buried it. So in 2000 election, after that, there was a change of ministers, and the new minister, or the then minister, as I recall, I'm trying to remember his name. He was from Quebec, and he put forth a bill that was, quite frankly, so bad that, I don't know, 15 Liberal MPs voted against it. Which is unheard of. And it died a death, as it should, and nothing happened. Mm-hmm. So it's about the status quo. And you can say, well, who's manipulating this? Well, it's tough to know all of the forces involved, but it's safe to assume that the bureaucrats, there were seven people who had control of the file in the minister's bureaucracy in the Department of Justice, not in her office, but in the Department of Justice.
Right.
And it's safe to say that I think they were all women, and that they had a certain slant on it, and they weren't going to move. And so ministers come and go, your civil servants stay.
Vested interests.
And it just died a natural death.
Right.
But I would point out that in subsequent parliaments, that when the Harper government was in, the then Minister of Justice, whose face I can see and whose name I can't think of, he's from Niagara Falls area. He said, no, we didn't need parliamentary reform. We needed more judges.
That's kind of counterintuitive.
So it's not just one brand of politics. It's
across the board.
Yeah, and I always think I had this saying at one point that the last place you'll find justice is in the Department of Justice, and I still stand by that. So.
Okay, last question. I'm just putting everybody on notice. This is the last question I have. So I will invite questions after this. How do you suggest we move forward to get shared parenting in Canada as the default? I suppose similar to the Swedish model.
Yeah, well, it's also being enacted in several states south of me here in the U.S. So there are many, because in the U.S. divorce is state jurisdiction. So there are many states in the U.S. that have been enacting shared parenting in some form or another. Mm-hmm. How do we do it in Canada? We're a different beast up in this part of the world. I think, and this is just my thought. And we've missed, the Divorce Act has been amended by the Trudeau government, all right? Mm-hmm. And they've changed the vocabulary, but they haven't changed anything else, all right? The meanings, the real
intent,
all right? And they trumpet the fact that they've included domestic violence in the new Divorce Act, as a factor. Well, I'm just abhorred by that. I just find that that's plain wrong. Mm-hmm. Domestic violence is if it's domestic violence, it's criminal. All right.
Right.
So put it in the criminal courts. It's not a matter for divorce courts, but of course, we have all these very people who say no, and they're the ones who ultimately write these bills. Mm-hmm. So. How do we do it? Well, let's acknowledge that we have lots of time to do it, because divorce law amending or rewriting, whatever you want to call it, is a sort of a once in a generation type thing, right? Right. It doesn't happen very often. And so there's lots of time, but I think that groups have to become more militant. I really do. They've got to start out by educating the public and members of parliament. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult, particularly now where members of parliament or candidates for elected office are more likely to be chosen by the party apparatus, right, as opposed to being really representative of the riding. So I think that people have to become really militant, and they have to go after them. And I give you this comparison. Years ago, there was a group called this, and I can't remember their names, but it was the women's groups, and it was, Judy Rebick and people like that who would come to Ottawa and meet with the Minister of Justice, and they would use all kinds of four-letter language at him and around him and with his staff. They were downright nasty and rude. But look what it got them. It got them everything they wanted.
That they wanted.
I'm not saying that people have to be ignorant and nasty and rude, but they've got to be much more firm with the politicians.
Well, and I guess as Parental Alienation Canada's our group on Facebook, I mean, we just have such a small footprint. We're just trying to rise up in some way. Is there some way or means that you can see that, like, there seems to be a lot of separate silos of these types of groups? Well, and how do you pull together to make change for the better? And that's why I got involved, right? I see all these different people or groups of people, and they're all sort of doing their own thing. Some are angry, some are hostile, but we try to focus on educational information. That's why you're here.
And your group has made, I think, great strides. Because,
right. It's only a year old. We're still getting our feet wet.
In years past, parental alienation. Oh yeah, we've heard of that. Yeah. But it's much more prevalent today. When I say much more prevalent, I mean talk of it is much more prevalent, and understanding and research is being done. So that's a positive. But
Okay.
how does it happen? It's got to come with a unification of some group above, and a funding to push it. I mean, it's always about money. Remember, the women's groups are all funded. They're
Well,
all funded. They're funded by government.
Well, do you see some way of pulling these various groups together and funding? And I know that's a loaded question, but you got to ask, right?
The simple answer, no, I don't. I'm too old for that. But there was a time when I thought it might happen, and I'm talking now at the time of the committee, because I call it it was the Prague Spring. It was like Czechoslovakia.
Okay, yeah.
Could talk, and talk to each other, but that all passed, right?
Right.
All aside. There was a time when the press covered it objectively. So there were guys like Bob Fife. He now calls himself Robert Fife. All right.
Mm-hmm.
In the Sun newspapers. Another obscure guy by the name of Mike Duffy was a big supporter.
Mike Duffy.
Yeah,
from PEI, yeah.
Yeah, well, he was a top drawer CTV reporter. Remember that?
Before. Oh yeah.
Right. So there was a lot of really positive coverage of it, but once that ended, then it just went down the other side.
Right.
It went into obscurity.
So
there has to be some way, but I don't know. I mean, this requires a group of people to get together and really discuss over a long period of time how this can. Who you can pull together, how you can fund it, and how you can make it happen.
Well, and then how do you engage politicians to get change, right?
Well, you see, the Status of Women group did it.
Right.
They did it by an annual gathering in Ottawa. They did things like they claimed that they represented women, virtually all women. Well, that was interesting,
Mm-hmm.
My 90-year-old mother belonged to the Anglican Church women. They said they represented her. Well, I don't think she knew of them. All right. So it was just a lot of hyperbole, a lot of puffery, but they were very loud and noisy. And they were funded. That's the important thing. It was money, and it was government money that was doing it.
Well, someday you may see Monique and myself in front of the Peace Tower. Getting arrested. No, I'm just kidding.
There was a fellow in New Brunswick. Steve. I can't remember his last name. And Steve was accused of some sort of improper conduct with his two daughters. Right.
Right.
And then it turned out in court, it came out that wasn't the case, but the accusation had been made by his wife. And so when Steve said to the judge, well, what about the accusation? The judge said, well, sometimes little lies or something to that effect are okay in this court. Well, how can this be? How can you gauge a big lie versus a little lie? Anyways,
a lie is a lie. Yeah.
He quit his job, and he had one of those sandwich boards, and he paraded at that courthouse for 1 year. And did he affect change? Well, I won't get into it, but yes, he did. But in that part of the world, he did.
We got attention though, right? And
yes, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to open it up to the floor. I do see some questions, but what I would ask if you're a little reticent to ask the question, put it in the chat. If not, I'm just going to go through the list that's in the chat and ask that. M. James, did you have a question? Or did you want me to ask it? I'll ask it. What is your stance on parental alienation? It's kind of a long one. What is your stance on parental alienation in extreme cases where one parent has made malicious and vexatious statements to police in order to have the other parent falsely imprisoned and or deported from Canada in order to get them out of the child's life? And then there's a follow-up question.
Well, people who make false allegations or false statements to police upon which police act are themselves committing a criminal offense.
Right, but they often don't act, right?
They often don't act, yes. So people have to have legal representation that will push that issue.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to say that, but that's the way it is. Or maybe you need to hire a public relations group to push the issue in the press. But and I'm being flippant about that. But
that's a good idea.
That's the only way out of it, isn't it? It's the only way out of it.
Sort of essentially using the system back at them.
Yeah, because there's no other outside way of doing it.
Influence. Okay. Second part to this question is, if the victim parent was falsely imprisoned for many days, but ultimately not guilty of anything at all, but then had to retain defense lawyers, family lawyers, and immigration lawyers to deal with everything, what consequences do you think the offending parent should face?
Well, they should go to jail in a sense. Okay. So they should be put on trial,
right?
And for perjury, and let the judge decide what should happen to them.
But again, that sort of goes back to what you said previously, where these laws are on the books.
I don't know if people remember the time of, I think it was in the 80s, and something called repressed memory syndrome.
Right.
All right. So it was about families usually, and little Mary would say, I remember now. She would be 30 years old and she was having some sort of a problem, and she'd go to a doctor or a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and they would say, we're going to bring out your past memories, and she would have these so-called repressed memories, right?
Right.
That she had been sexually molested by her brother. All right. Now that's a terrible thing. All right. Not only was it terrible, but it was false. All right. But it became very much in vogue until a time when it was shown that false memory syndrome was absolutely bogus, false, garbage. All right. But there were lots of people who were imprisoned and suffered greatly. Families were destroyed by it.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened to them? Well, not a whole lot. All right, not a whole lot, because it was, generally said, well, this doctor, did this to her, and so the doctor would walk, the accuser would walk, and the victim would sometimes sue in civil court.
Civil court.
For damages. Right?
Okay.
I call it the O.J. Simpson way. O.J. Simpson was acquitted, but his in-laws, his ex-in-laws, sued him for $12 million. All right, and that's basically what's left for people in those cases. If the criminal courts won't, or if the attorneys won't, the crown attorneys won't do anything, then it's up to
civilly.
Yeah, it's not a. I know it's not a very satisfactory answer, but I don't have any other answer.
Well, that's an expensive fence to jump, right?
Oh, absolutely, and it's a long-term fence.
Right.
But it happened because all of these, this was the latest medical thing. We go through these periods of these social
back and forth, and
but of these social phenomenon. So like years ago, it was people had multiple personalities. Then it was repressed memory. Right?
Okay.
Oh, it was terrible. All these things that happened to me, none of them happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a belief, and it was
and it's embedded.
Yeah, and that's what much of what we're dealing with today are these accusations that are patently false, just totally false. Not a shred of evidence. But that doesn't matter. I'll give you a quick example of a gentleman. I won't say where he was, but he was in a major city in Canada, and he was accused 5 times by his ex of, once again, sexual impropriety with his children. And 5 times the children's aid investigated, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it was on 3 occasions he wasn't even in the country.
But
but notwithstanding that, the children's aid just kept coming.
tarred and feathered.
All right. Why? Well, their answer is, well, we have no discretion. If there's a complaint, we just must investigate.
Right.
Well, are these people so limited in their understanding of human nature that, after 2 or 3 allegations where there's not a shred of anything,
Right.
they come back a 4th and 5th time, or after 2 allegations, they come back a 3rd and 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th time. I mean, there's something profoundly wrong, yet the accuser walks.
So it's like common sense is out the window, but bureaucratic sense is all over the place. Kind of.
I call it make work projects.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah.
I was trying to be polite.
About job security for them. So,
Yeah,
anyway.
exactly.
Yeah, go ahead.
The next person, Karina, had a question. What are some consequences to being in contempt? And mom moved before getting a court order 2 weeks after signing a very drawn out 7-year heated dispute that ended in a settlement days before trial. Mm-hmm. So what are some consequences to being in contempt of an order like that? And what do you think should happen?
Well, contempt is up to a judge, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, there's different levels of contempt.
There certainly are. But I can think of one case where a mother was incarcerated for a very, like I'll say, 10 days or something. It was a short period for contempt, and she had denied the father access, umpteen times. But we all have heard of those cases, right? Mm-hmm. So in one particular case, a judge woke up and said enough is enough, and said, your time out for you. You're going to the slammer for 10 days. Or some period of time, but it's so rare. It's so rare.
Right. I do have, it's not really a question, but the Bar Association makes billions off, well, probably not billion, well, maybe billions off of high conflict divorce. How do you see that affecting outcomes of? How
do I see what the Bar Association?
Yeah, how do you, because you mentioned women's groups previously. Yeah. I guess the question would be, what groups have a vested interest in maintaining the
Yeah, well, certainly the bar does, yeah. And I think you'll find that the fastest growing segment of the bar is family law.
Family court.
Yeah, family law.
Oddly enough, they bill by the hour, right? You can't.
It's a huge business. It's a huge business. And, they're not doing anything illegal per se.
Mm-hmm.
They're practicing their trade, but it's the fastest growing. So it tells you something.
And Glenn mentioned equal shared parenting changes were blocked by legal vested interests and government funded ideological interest. Ideological, I'm sorry.
Is that Glenn Sheridan out there?
Yes, it is.
It is.
Hi, good to see you, Roger.
How are you? Nice to hear you.
I'm good.
He asks much better questions. I'm just going through the chat.
Well,
and you guys
I've been
can have
glancing
it.
at the side here, and I see the name Steve and Steve Osborne.
I put in Steve Osborne's name, and I think the minister you were looking for was Martin Cochon, who put in that other bill.
That's a case of suppressing my memory.
Well, Glenn did have a question. He was more like an attaboy to Roger. Do you want to follow up on that, Glenn?
I don't know.
Yes, indeed. Well, Roger, I wanted to thank you for all of the work that you've done over these many years. You're certainly an inspiration, and I'm still at it. I'm still fighting there. I did want to, perhaps get your blood pressure up a little bit by mentioning that one of the fights we had was that recent changes to the Divorce Act. And that was that after the bill, which basically did these cosmetic changes and added in this domestic violence thing, is that after it had been passed by the House of Commons and after it had passed by the Senate, the Minister of Justice changed the bill by removing the friendly parent section title. As he said, the reason for doing that was to make it absolutely clear out there to the legal profession that this didn't mean equality of parents or shared parenting in any way, shape, or form. So to my mind, that to me is contempt of Parliament. They're
Well,
legally able to do that, but to me, it's an outrage that the vested interests in the Minister of Justice should be able to change a law after it had been passed by Parliament.
yes, well, they do it by regulation, generally speaking.
No, it wasn't done by regulation. It's actually changing the bill because apparently a title doesn't have a substantive effect to the bill. So they actually changed the bill after it had been passed. But to me, this is an outrage. I mean, they're legally able to do it, but it still is an outrage.
Well, also understand that a minister in a previous government invited the courts to set the support guidelines for husbands.
Spousal support.
Spousal support, yeah.
Yeah.
That was never debated, never even passed, never arrived in the House of Commons or the Senate. It was done by the courts in conjunction with the Canadian Bar Association. That was probably about 2003, 4, 5, sometime around there.
Right.
And, that
was Rolly Thompson who did that in conjunction with some lawyer bureaucrat from Justice, I think.
Yes, it was. Yeah. And I know I made a lot of noise about it, but nobody really cares. So goodbye.
We do. Okay. If you have,
thank you, Roger. Thank you for all your work and your efforts over the years and sticking it to them.
Well,
as best you can.
Well, you have to fight. I always regarded myself as an independent, even though I was elected as a liberal. I shouldn't say as an independent. I was a liberal, and I'm not a liberal anymore. Or I shouldn't say that. I'm still a liberal. The party that calls itself liberal is no longer liberal.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the same with the Conservative Party, right? Yeah. It's they've both sort of. Yeah. It's a different political life than it was in the 50s and 60s. And yes, I'm old enough to remember that. Believe it or not, I'm lucky enough to have hair still.
Oh, darn.
I didn't mean that way, Roger. I'm sorry. Okay, if you have a question, can you put your hand up, or there's a little on the bottom, a little thing with your hand. But I see Misty, or no, Chris. Go ahead.
Hi, Roger. Pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So we have talked a bunch about what can be done, and you sort of said that it's a once in a generation chance to change family legislation. How effective do you think would be in the meantime to go after the family service industry as
good question?
This is a bias in family court.
When you
a civil or a lawsuit against these organizations, right?
When you say the family service organization, can you give me an example?
Well, a lot of it is referred to as women's services, but childcare services and all the like Strong Start and stuff that's very tailored to women.
Yes.
Like we blame it on the courts, but the courts really are just sort of doing the inevitable once family service industry sets up one side of the family to provide the best care, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Out here in BC, there's been a movement for quite some time to register social workers. The family service industry is basically unregulated across most of the country. And there are fairly active groups across the country involving large amounts of women that have been trying to bring accountability to the family service industry. We've been trying to bring them together with the sort of alienated parent scene out here in BC. And recently there was a private members bill to register social workers out here. And the whole idea is that if we can introduce accountability into the field, then we can start raising the question about biased delivery of service. In BC, they're actually talking about integrating social workers into health, and making it under the health service. So that would mean that they would, I guess, have to provide the same level of unbiased service as the health service. So do you see that as a valid sort of backdoor hack to work on in the meantime?
Well, registering social workers, I don't know that what really profound effect it would have. I think there has to be, there has to be accountability. I can think of a case from years ago in BC where a social worker worked for the government of British Columbia, just found ways of ignoring a judge's order. And in other words, yeah, so the social worker knew more than the judge, or didn't hear what the judge said, or couldn't read. And anyways, and it went on and on and on. I mean, it was pretty rotten. And finally, the judge hauled this individual before him or her, and they gave in. But in the meantime, a father was not seeing a child, and it went on for some period of time. Now, I don't know what effect that would, changing the status of the social worker would have. It requires more. I don't know if you can sue. I don't imagine you can sue. I hadn't thought about that. Whether you could sue somebody for, some sort of negligence or malfeasance, but
it's sort of a matter of accountability.
You have to start somewhere, and if registration will do it, then we'll move it along a little bit, then do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, just as a corollary to that, Chris, in other discussions, I've heard people mention doing a class action suit against some of that. Is that a potentiality?
No, it's more sort of introducing accountability into the field. Right now, you can't complain against, you can't file complaints against most of the family service sector, even the government-funded family service sector. The only people you can complain about them is to themselves. And they can do things like, they can literally do things like say, abuse of power that's out of our jurisdiction to investigate that because it's not happening on company time. So the whole idea is to introduce professional standards.
All right.
Within the profession. And out here, it was sort of a fluke that nobody really wants to touch it. I've talked to members of the BC legislature out here that are like, I agree with you, but won't touch that one with a 10-foot pole. It would kill my career. And the way they finally came around to doing it was just incorporating the whole thing into BC Health and creating a new, they're supposed to be creating a new college of social workers that would be under Health BC and the new BC Health regulatory.
All right.
So I wanted to make a suggestion here, Chris. Mm-hmm. And that is that there's a fellow in Ontario, Vern Beck, who's done an awful lot of very good work going up against the corresponding agency in Ontario. And one of the tactics that he used, and it's worth contacting him for a lot of the other tactics, and that is challenging these people on the basis they were using unlicensed social workers. So by challenging that, he was saying that the regulations in the Children's Aid Society is that they have to use the social workers. So if they're using an unlicensed social worker, one who's not registered properly with the government, then their rulings can be challenged, and particularly in court. So
the entire family service industry is unregistered. There are loopholes across this country, province by province. In some provinces, it's like a direct loophole, and some they call them family service workers. But social family service workers across this country are unregulated.
You might be surprised if you look into the actual regulations there, but it requires a fairly careful look into. I'm suggesting that it is usually possible to use their regulations against them, and that's been the tactic, at least in Ontario, and I see in other provinces as well.
There's battles for that, but they still don't really have to be registered. That's the whole problem.
But they're almost certainly breaking some rules. That's what those bureaucracies do. And when they break their own rules of morality and law and this sort of thing, you're right. It's hard to enforce that. But if they break their own rules, that's usually where you've got them. But it's mostly tactical.
Anyways, I'm putting it forward as an area that we could work on.
Absolutely.
Because so much of the bias doesn't actually come from the courts. It comes from the fact that there's all these services available to women, so that when they walk into court, they just have to say, I'm lined up with all these services for my child. And the judge has no choice at that point, the way things are written, but to give the child to the women. So I don't know. It's all along the whole lines of CCMF and what CAFE's doing. Actually providing services for the men.
Right.
And so it's not really about social worker accountability. It's about introducing accountability into the industry so that we can demand removal of bias from their delivery of services. Or so that they can provide services for men. I mean, you know.
That's an interesting point. Many years ago, a man, well, it still happens in Ontario, men are required to go and take anger management courses because men are angry. But have you ever checked with your local agencies and to find out if there's any anger management courses for women? And the answer is no.
No.
There aren't. And in Alberta, years ago in Edmonton, they launched some sort of a human rights complaint and won, and forced the then apparatus in Alberta to offer or to be required to provide anger management for women. It was looked into in Ontario, but the Ontario legislation was different than human rights, and they could get away with it. It's a patchwork across the country of rules.
Well, something that comes to mind just last week or the week before, the Associate Minister of Health, I believe, Mr. Leung, amidst great fanfare, they have a new group called, I think it's Men and they had the police chief there, and they had ex-police chief of City of Calgary and a couple of other actors, and to prevent violence. And when I thought, okay, maybe this is interesting to watch, they went with the rat hole of violence, and it was all, how do you anger management help anger management against men, nothing against women. And with financially, the women's groups got $2.3 million and the men's groups got 100,000. So right there, right? It's anyway, I didn't mean to steal your thunder there.
No, that's a perfect point. That's it. And Chris raised it. It's the money flows in one direction, and it's not towards men in general.
Well, and it was a men's help group within a battered woman's shelter group, so they assume that men are angry already, just from the get-go, just the general basis of why they exist, right? Which is unfair.
Well, it's like all these, people now in offices are being subjected to taking a course on anti-harassment training. Well, that's to assume that they're in some way at risk of harassing someone, isn't it? Why would you, if you work at a place, why would you go and say, I'm going to go and take this course because I might turn bad and harass someone? It's an assumption of guilt.
Exactly.
And therefore, everybody needs therapy of some description, particularly men. Right? Whether in the workplace or in the home or whatever, men need therapy. Women, some of them, but not so often.
Their mothers, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Mothering instinct. Do we have any other questions? Okay, floor is yours, bud.
I got another question. After Bill 560, or was it 560, the failure of the Shared Parenting Act, do ministers in Ottawa tend to look at that term as dead? And would it be worth finding another phrase to describe it in order to potentially push the cause forward, with politicians that are listening?
Change the name to try to fool them. I don't see that as is doing anything. Not a thing. Their minds are made up. It doesn't matter. Their minds are made up. And I think that when I saw the last go round, as Glenn was mentioning, with respect to introduction of domestic violence into the Divorce Act, that was to me the absolute victory of the feminist groups. I go back to where I started with the committee. The groups used to come to the committee in every province, as you know, was their right, and everybody had a chance to speak. And afterwards, maybe a week later, I would receive a letter, because I remember I was the chair of the committee from the House of Commons side, and then there was a senator. Her name was Landon Pearson, was the chair for the Senate side. So I would receive a letter, probably on a weekly basis, from some group of representing a shelter, a women's shelter. And I was copied the letter. It was addressed to the Prime Minister usually. And it said that they had been before the committee and they had been attacked by Ann Cools. Well, this is quite a revelation, isn't it? That in a room with, you know, several hundred people, somebody could be attacked and nobody
Costed.
and nobody else saw it. All right.
It's funny, so, but not.
Yeah, well, it's an indication of what an attack is. So Anne would say something like this. Here's a question. Remember, we're dealing with marriage, right? We're dealing with custody and access, and it has to require, it's with respect to people who are married, because it's the Divorce Act, all right? Mm-hmm. So she would ask a question about the shelter, and they would say, we had, you know, X number of women come to the shelter last week, all right? And she would ask a question, well, of that number, how many were married?
Mm-hmm.
And they would go crazy. I mean, they would just go, they would become very hostile towards her, because it wasn't, you know, it was all about violence. Well, you know, if the violence is occurring because, is occurring in a group that is not married, that's very germane to this discussion. But it didn't matter to them. So to me, when I saw this in the act, what I'm saying is that the narrative that men are violent and women are victims is they won. They've won it. I hate to say it, but that's the case.
Mm-hmm. It's just so pervasive in everything that you do that men are assumed to be violent or aggressive. Aggressive,
yeah. And so you see this. I had a call a couple of years ago from a fellow, and he and his wife, they both lost their jobs. Oh, it's quite a while ago. They both lost their jobs the same day. They worked in different places, and they were both unemployed, given the gate the same day. It was during some sort of a economic downturn in this part of the world. Anyways, so things were a little rough at home. So they got into a heated argument a few days later, and a neighbor heard the noise and called the police. Well, you know what happened. Mm-hmm. It was all downhill from there. He was removed, and he was told if he went and took an, you know, plead guilty and take an anger management course, and all will be forgiven. Well, he refused, and his wife said to the Crown's office, "I'm not going to come and testify. In fact, I'm telling you, we were both guilty." And in the end, she prevailed. They dropped the charge, but holy geez, it was close. And he had to spend a couple of $1,000s in the meantime, having a lawyer on, you know, standby. There's that kind of nonsense that the assumption is the man must be charged, and it's absolutely wrong. But how do you change that mindset amongst the police? Mm-hmm. Well, you can't change the mindset amongst the police, because the police must do it. It's their operating directives. So they have no choice. There's another place you could start changing the police procedures.
Processes and procedures, yeah.
Oh, yeah, this is hard.
Who's next?
If I can suggest,
don't be shy. Yes, go ahead.
I was going to suggest, Glenn, it's Glenn speaking here.
Yeah.
Sorry, my camera is not working for some odd reason on there. But anyway, I did want to mention that with this new bill that was essentially it was proclaimed or in effect as of March of this year, so it's quite recent. One of the things that they put in there in the domestic violence section is recognizing coercive and controlling behavior as domestic violence. Now, the one campaign that we're working on right now is to get parental alienation recognized as coercive and controlling behavior. To me, it's obvious, but in fact, there's a real need to battle at the provincial level to get the provinces who implement all of this to get recognition that parental alienation is coercive and controlling behavior. And that would go a long way to solving a lot of these problems in family court.
Absolutely.
And then, interestingly, we just had a similar question from a member of the group here. And I'll sort of paraphrase it. Are family court judges capable, and this goes back to what we were discussing before with criminal offenses, are family court judges capable of addressing civil actions for defamation and slander, false reports to police, etc., in the same proceeding? Or should the civil suits be handled separately by another judge to allow for all evidence to be heard and allow the course of trials without backing up the family court system and having potential bias from the family court judge? So I guess this sort of goes back to what we're talking about with civil court in some way.
A provincial court judge cannot hear
Queen's Court.
a civil action. So,
Right.
So there's no question about that. It's got to be a Section 96 judge.
Okay.
Or I guess you could go to a small claims court, perhaps.
Right. What's the limit there? 25,000, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, good question. Who's next? Nobody? Okay. Well, I've been sort of instructed. I understood this was for 2 hours, but I've been told that it was for an hour and a half. Okay, is it? But when Monique and I were talking, we would love to have both you and Glenn back. Is that a possible?
That's
a possibility?
A possibility, sure.
Okay, and how often?
I'm fine with that.
No, it actually,
I can shine by Roger, reflected glory from Roger.
well, I think we all can't we? But it would be a really interesting thing for, well, in my mind, probably for other people to have both of you here, Roger and Glenn. Sure. Your backgrounds are enormous.
Winter's coming and I tend to flee the jurisdiction.
You're in Florida?
I don't go to, I'll tell you, I don't go to Florida because there's too many old people there.
Yeah, I don't want to stay away from that too.
No, we go elsewhere. So.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay, well, I'm gonna wrap this up, but we will definitely we'll be in touch with both of you, Roger and Glenn, to see if we could do a dual session. I think this was a brilliant idea. And we'll advertise the crap out of it this time, right?
Sorry about the start of this too.
Oh no, that's fine. That's fine. We all had technical. I was having trouble logging in. Just an FYI for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Out there, thank you. I've quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. It's and I keep thinking of Alan J. And I don't know why. Probably because I'm from Cape Breton Island as well. But anyway, he was trouble. I still have a shirt when his election said "We reckon McKechnie." Well, anyway, that's sorry. Yeah. But yeah, well, if you have for the rest of the group, feel free to go to our website or our Facebook page, Parental Alienation Canada. We're slowly trying to make it bilingual, so we have information across the country. And we realized it was sort of we advertised as best we could, but I think it would be absolutely brilliant to have Roger and Glenn share time here. So we'll organize something offline and we'll be in touch with you. And we thank everybody else for showing up.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very
for
much,
doing it.
guys. Take care.
Thanks. Bye. Good night.
Okay.
Right.
Good night. Bye-bye. And thank you for showing up.